I told myself I wouldn't go back to Lucas Carter's dorm. For 2 days, I avoided the football wing entirely, choosing longer routes across campus, burying myself in assignments that suddenly felt urgent. But avoidance didn't quiet the thoughts. It sharpened them. Every pause in my routine filled with the memory of his voice, the weight of that unfinished conversation. When Lucas texted me, "Can we talk again?" I don't think I explained myself well. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. He didn't mention Emily. He didn't need to. Her absence in his words was already becoming a pattern that I went back. This time, the dorm felt smaller, more intimate. The lights were dimmed, the trophies still lining the walls like silent witnesses. Lucas didn't pretend this was casual. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees, as if bracing for impact. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About not wanting to be a mistake." "And?" I asked. "And I think I already am one," he replied. "Just not in the way people assume." Lucas talked about Emily then, finally using her name. He spoke with respect, almost reverence. She was loyal. Patient. She believed in the version of him that showed up on game days and family dinners. The problem wasn't her. It was him. "I care about her," he said, voice low. "But sometimes it feels like I'm acting out a life I agreed to before I understood myself." I listened, knowing that understanding him didn't absolve either of us. Emotional honesty can be a form of intimacy, and intimacy can be a betrayal long before anyone touches. I felt the pull of being needed, of being seen as the person he trusted with his uncertainty. That role felt intoxicating, and wrong. "You shouldn't be saying this to me," I said. "I know," Lucas admitted. "But I don't know who else would listen without telling me who I'm supposed to be." There it was. The justification we both leaned on. He wasn't asking for permission to cheat, he was asking for permission to feel. The distinction mattered to him. It mattered less to my conscience. The room grew quiet. Lucas turned on a small speaker, letting soft music fill the spaces words no longer could. We sat side by side, not touching, but close enough to sense each other's presence. Every shift of his posture felt intentional, every breath measured. That I became aware of how easily emotional boundaries dissolve when no one names them. How silence can be an agreement if left unchecked. "I think about you," Lucas said suddenly. "Not often," he clarified. "Just enough to notice. Just enough to matter." The confession tightened something in my chest. "That's not fair," I replied, though I didn't specify to whom. Lucas nodded. "I know. And I hate that it feels honest." In that moment, I realized I had stopped being a listener and become a participant. Even without action, my presence altered his decisions. I was no longer neutral. I was a possibility. My phone vibrated between us, breaking the tension. Lucas glanced at it, then looked away. "It's Emily," he said. He didn't reach for the phone right away. That hesitation said more than any declaration could. He wasn't choosing me outright, but he wasn't choosing her either, not in that moment. The space between intention and action widened, and we stood in it together. "You should answer," I said quietly. "In a minute," he replied. That minute stretched. The music continued. The dorm felt suspended, as if time itself was waiting for a decision neither of us wanted to make. I thought about how infidelity is often described as a single act, a moment of weakness. But sitting there, I understood it differently. It was accumulation. A series of small choices that felt harmless on their own. Lucas finally picked up the phone and silenced it without reading the message. He exhaled slowly, eyes closed, as if bracing for regret. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. I stood, needing distance before that confusion pulled me closer. "Then we need to stop pretending this is nothing." Lucas looked up at me, conflict etched into his expression. He didn't argue. He didn't agree. He only nodded, as if acknowledging a truth he wasn't ready to face. As I left the dorm that night, I felt no triumph, only a heavy awareness. Whatever line we hadn't crossed physically had already blurred beyond recognition. And somewhere, unknowingly, Emily was waiting for a message that represented loyalty neither of us was sure still existed. The story, I knew, was no longer about temptation, that it was about consequences that hadn't arrived yet, but were already on their way. The bathroom was warmer than the rest of the house, heavy with steam and the faint scent of soap. Daniel closed the door behind us, not with force, but with intention. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have, as if the house itself had taken note of what we were about to do. Neither of us spoke at first. Daniel leaned against the counter, one hand braced on the porcelain sink, his gaze fixed on the mirror instead of me. I stood near the door, my fingers grazing the cool wood, my pulse unsteady. In the reflection, our eyes met briefly, then drifted apart again. It felt safer not to look for too long. This wasn't the plan, Daniel said quietly. I nodded. It never is. He exhaled, a tired sound that carried more weight than words. I keep telling myself I'm just lonely. That this feeling will pass. And does it? I asked. Daniel finally turned to face me. Up close, I could see the strain in his expression, the careful control beginning to fracture. No, he admitted. It just changes shape. The honesty in his voice unsettled me. I had come prepared for temptation, not for truth. I took a step closer without meaning to, drawn by the vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. The space between us shrank until the air felt scarce. This isn't fair, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to protect. I know, Daniel replied. But it feels real. That word lingered between us. Real. It had always been the problem. What we shared wasn't a fantasy built on impulse, it was something that had grown quietly, fed by patience and denial. The knowledge made the moment heavier, not lighter. Daniel reached out, then stopped, his hand hovering near my wrist. He waited. The pause mattered. It was his last attempt at restraint, and he knew it. I knew it too. That I didn't pull away. When his fingers finally closed around my wrist, the contact was gentle, almost reverent. He guided me closer, as if afraid a sudden movement might break whatever fragile permission existed between us. My thoughts scattered, replaced by a keen awareness of breath, warmth, and proximity. I should stop, Daniel said, though he didn't loosen his grip. So should I answered. Neither of us moved. He drew me toward him, and in that motion, the world narrowed to the small space we occupied. The mirror fogged further, blurring our reflections until they were indistinct shapes pressed together. I focused on the sound of my own heartbeat, on the steady rise and fall of Daniel's chest, on the way his certainty faltered when our foreheads touched. What happened next didn't need description. It lived in implication, in the way time seemed to slip, in the way choices once theoretical became irreversible. I knew, even then, that crossing this line would not bring clarity. It would only deepen the questions we had been avoiding. When we finally stepped apart, the silence felt altered, heavier than before. Daniel turned away, reaching for a towel, his movements slower now. I watched him, searching for something familiar, something reassuring. Instead, I saw distance beginning to form. This can't continue, he said, his voice steadier than his hands. I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. I know. But knowing didn't undo what had been done. It didn't soften the way the moment already felt like a memory, slipping beyond reach even as it ended. I felt an ache settle in my chest, the kind that comes from realizing you wanted more than the moment was ever meant to give. Daniel met my eyes once more, and this time there was no invitation there, only regret mixed with something unresolved. You should go, he said gently. I picked up the jacket from where I had left it by the sink, the original reason for my visit suddenly absurd. At the door, I hesitated, hoping he might say something that would make sense of everything that he didn't. As I stepped back into the quiet hallway, I understood that what had just happened was not a beginning, but a fracture. One that would widen with time, demanding answers neither of us was ready to face. I stepped out of Daniel's house into a late afternoon that looked unchanged, as if the world had decided not to notice what I had done. The sky was pale, the street quiet, and somewhere nearby a dog barked with careless certainty. I stood there for a moment, jacket folded under my arm, feeling as though I had left a part of myself behind in the steam-filled bathroom. The walk home felt longer than it should have. Every step gave my thoughts room to grow louder. I replayed Daniel's pauses, his restraint, the way his voice had steadied when he told me to go. It struck me that the calm he found afterward had not been peace, but control returning to claim its place. I wondered what he was doing now. I wondered if he was already convincing himself that this had been a mistake worth forgetting. That night, my phone stayed silent. No message. No acknowledgement. I told myself it was for the best, yet disappointment pressed heavily against that logic. For months, Daniel's words had slipped easily into my evenings, filling the spaces I pretended were empty. Without them, the silence felt accusatory. Days passed. When Daniel finally texted, it was brief and careful. He asked if I was okay. He did not ask how I felt. I answered in the same tone, polite and restrained, as if we were strangers who had merely shared a long conversation once. The restraint hurt more than distance would have done. I began to see the truth more clearly with time. What I had mistaken for intimacy was also escape. Daniel had been running from something, and I had mistaken being chosen as being valued. The difference mattered. It always had. Guilt arrived slowly, then all at once. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It settled quietly, in moments I least expected. When I thought of the life Daniel returned to each evening. When I imagined explanations being formed, silences being filled with omissions. I realized that infidelity did not require cruelty to cause harm. It only required secrecy that I tried to justify my part in it. I reminded myself that Daniel was the one who was married, that his choices carried greater consequence. But the comfort of that thought faded quickly. I had known enough to walk away. I had chosen not to. That choice belonged to me. We saw each other once more, by accident, at a gathering we both almost avoided. Our conversation stayed surface level, careful and brief. Daniel looked tired, older somehow. When our eyes met, there was recognition, but also a boundary firmly in place. Whatever existed between us had not survived exposure to reality. After that, I stopped waiting for his messages. I stopped constructing scenarios where the outcome might have been different if I had said or done one thing differently. I understood then that some moments feel transformative not because they lead somewhere, but because they force you to confront who you are when desire outweighs principle. That I began to ask myself harder questions. Why had I accepted being someone's secret? Why had I measured my worth by the attention of someone who could only offer fragments of himself? The answers weren't flattering, but they were honest. And honesty, I was learning, was a form of repair. In the end, Daniel did not disappear from my life entirely. He became a lesson instead of a longing. A reminder that connection without clarity breeds confusion, and that intimacy built on absence can never stand in the light. Sometimes, I still think of that hallway, the open bathroom door, the moment before everything tipped forward. I don't wish it undone, but I don't romanticize it either. It was a turning point, not toward love, but toward understanding. That I walked away from Daniel carrying more than regret. I carried awareness. And for the first time, that felt like enough to begin again, even if the path ahead remained uncertain. Weeks passed, and with them came a version of quiet I had never learned how to sit with before. Not the dramatic silence of heartbreak, but the steady kind that forces reflection. Daniel no longer occupied my daily thoughts the way he once had, yet his absence still shaped them. He had become a reference point, a marker of who I had been at a certain moment in my life. That I tried to return to old routines. Morning walks. Late night music. Conversations with friends who knew nothing about what had happened. On the surface, everything appeared intact. But underneath, something had shifted. I was no longer able to ignore the way I had compromised myself in exchange for temporary closeness. Daniel reached out again, unexpectedly, one evening. His message was longer this time, less guarded. He said he had been thinking a lot. He said the silence between us had not brought him relief, only clarity. I read his words slowly, aware of how easily they could have pulled me back if I had encountered them weeks earlier. That we agreed to meet, not in private, but in a quiet cafe near the edge of town. When Daniel arrived, he looked composed, but there was a heaviness in his posture that hadn't been there before. We spoke carefully at first, as if testing the ground between us. I'm trying to fix things, Daniel said at last. At home. With myself. I nodded. I believed him. Or at least, I believed that he believed it. I think that's good, I replied. And I meant it. That he studied my face, as though searching for disappointment or accusation. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I know, I answered. But intent doesn't change impact. The truth settled between us without resistance. There was no anger left to fuel an argument, no longing strong enough to distort reality. What remained was understanding, and with it, the quiet acceptance that what we shared could not exist without damage. I'm glad you came into my life, Daniel said after a pause. Even if it was wrong. I considered his words carefully. I'm glad I learned from it, I said. That matters more to me now. When we parted, there was no unfinished tension, no promise to stay in touch. Just a mutual acknowledgement that some connections serve their purpose by ending. I watched Daniel walk away, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only a calm sense of closure. In the days that followed, I noticed something subtle but important. I felt lighter. Not because the experience had been erased, but because I had stopped carrying it as something unresolved. I no longer needed to justify my actions or romanticize the pain they caused. I could see the moment for what it was, a collision of need, fear, and choice. That I began to imagine a different kind of future for myself. One where desire did not require secrecy. Where affection did not come with conditions. I understood now that love, to be sustaining, must be rooted in presence and honesty, not stolen moments and borrowed time. Sometimes, memory still brings me back to that day, to the steam-filled bathroom and the decision that altered everything. But the memory no longer defines me. It informs me. It reminds me that wanting something does not make it right, and that crossing a line always reveals more than it conceals. That I don't tell this story to condemn Daniel or absolve myself. I tell it because it marks the point where I stopped confusing intensity with intimacy. Where I learned that being chosen in secrecy is not the same as being chosen freely. There are still unanswered questions, and perhaps there always will be. But I have learned to live without needing every ending to feel perfect. Some endings are quiet. Some are instructive. And some, like this one, leave you standing at the edge of something new, finally ready to step forward without looking back.